Welcome back to Weekends with Anna and Michael. Now I want to kind of move on to some of the news that's been getting a lot of attention, online, on Twitter, especially among progressives. And it has to do with the next round of stimulus that was just debated and passed in the House. So the House just voted on another round of coronavirus stimulus, and they're referring to it as the HEROES Act. And as I think many people expected, there were important progressive provisions left out of this legislation. And it's definitely devastating, especially because there seemed to be a lot more coordination among progressive lawmakers and even outside progressive groups. But when push came to shove, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi got her way, and the final legislation didn't include incredibly important provisions, which I'll get to in just a second. But first, I think it's important to kind of contextualize everything and discuss what happened in the previous stimulus bill, where progressives actually had less leverage. So before, I think progressives had a little bit of difficulty in organizing. Ida Chavez at The Intercept wrote a great piece about this. And she writes, instead of organizing as a bloc to make coordinated demands or threatening to withhold votes, the progressive approach has been to meet with leadership individually with legislative wish lists with the hope that working behind the scenes will influence the legislation. Now, we've talked about theory of change here on Weekends, and my perspective is, if your theory of change is working with corrupt politicians who literally have a financial interest in defeating your provisions, you're not going to win. And so, like, the idea of trying to reason with Nancy Pelosi, it just seems nonsensical to me. I haven't seen that strategy work. And I think progressives who tried that strategy in the last stimulus bill saw how difficult it is to persuade her. Because again, you have to talk about her incentives, her financial priorities, and honestly, these progressive policies ain't it. Now, all of a sudden, things started to change, right? So after that stimulus bill passed, progressives actually start coordinating with one another. You have the Congressional Progressive Caucus working with outside progressive groups like Indivisible, Move On. And that gave people a lot of hope. And also keep in mind that progressives had a lot more leverage this time around, because the GOP has made it abundantly clear that they plan on defeating this bill. They think that, the deficit is out of control at this point. We're concerned about spending. And so we are not going to vote for legislation that's going to provide much needed relief to average Americans. So that means that Nancy Pelosi needs progressive lawmakers in the House to vote in favor of this bill, right? So progressives have more leverage. And let me just say, since the GOP has made it clear that they plan on defeating this legislation in the Senate, this is mostly a symbolic bill, right? This is essentially a way for House Democrats to say, this is where our values are. This is what we want to prioritize. This is how we want to help the average American. And even under this symbolic environment, you can't get someone like Nancy Pelosi to prioritize any type of progressive policy proposals. So in the end, what did the House overwhelmingly vote in favor of? Basically legislation that will not include $2,000 payments a month to families during the duration of this pandemic, which people desperately need in order to be able to pay their bills. It will not include the robust student loan debt forgiveness that was initially proposed by progressives. It also will not allow Americans to temporarily enroll in Medicare during the duration of the pandemic, which I think is incredibly important. Instead, this will be a way of subsidizing COBRA, which is a disastrous idea, because while workers might not be able to pay for their deductibles, House leadership is saying, well, we can help with premiums. Okay, but what is that going to do for someone who has no money to eat, much less pay or afford extremely expensive medical bills, right? So if you're hit with a huge deductible, you don't have the money to pay that deductible. You'll still be in financial ruin. And so there's also going to be a bailout for lobbyists in this legislation, something that Nancy Pelosi has been very much in favor of. And so you got to question what went wrong. You have progressives organizing finally. They have some leverage. This is a symbolic bill. Like, what did they do wrong? How did this kind of fall apart? And so I think it is important to kind of see what kind of mistakes were made along the way so we can prevent them in the future, right? And I have 3 takeaways from this. First, let me tell you what happened, though. So there was actually a lack of coordination, even though there was more organizing done. The truth of the matter is this group of progressives didn't agree with one another. And I think there are certainly people within the progressive caucus who aren't necessarily progressive and aren't in line with the policies that we desperately need. So, for instance, on April 23rd, Indivisible, with a few other groups, asked Democrats to pledge a no vote on the next coronavirus package if it leaves out their priorities. The ultimatum, though, bothered some lawmakers in the coalition who believed they shouldn't be put in the position of voting against desperately needed aid. Ocasio-Cortez had also threatened a no vote on the interim package during the April 20th news conference, which angered and surprised some of her colleagues who believed they should be winning positive support instead, according to people familiar with the matter. And then there was an issue with Move On. Basically, Move On decided to applaud this legislation, even though it left out the progressive policy proposals that we need. And that gave Nancy Pelosi all that she needed to go out there and say, I got progressive support. This is a great bill. Everybody, look at what a boss I am. I rip papers. I do sarcastic claps. I'm a real winner. I'm the resistance, right? So despite the bill's failure to include Jayapal's paycheck guarantee, Move On released a statement signed by a sweeping number of progressive groups, noting that it wasn't perfect, but praising it and urging its passage, pledging to mobilize their millions of members to pass the bill. And let me be clear about something. There are parts of this bill that should be applauded. It's not robust enough, not nearly robust enough, but it does expand the unemployment benefits, which I think are incredibly important. It does have a provision focused on saving the post office. I also think that's important. There's a provision on mail-in voting, again, important. But when it comes to like the basics, the fundamentals to survive in the middle of a pandemic, this bill leaves out, the ability to just enroll in Medicare and not have to worry about whether or not going to the doctor is going to bankrupt you during the pandemic. And so with Move On statements at hand, Nancy Pelosi was able to affirm to her caucus that she won the support of progressive groups, and she quickly dismissed the Congressional Progressive Caucus request to delay the vote. She then rewrote the bill, introducing what's known as a manager's amendment, moving it to the right in key areas, including on relief for student debt. Okay. And then I want to just give you Max Berger's comment on this, which blew my mind, really, because I feel like knowing who Max Berger is, someone who's very in tune with what's going on in our political climate, this is just a shocking statement because he should know better. He says, at some point, you have to ask yourself, if the reason that Pelosi doesn't include more oversight of the bailouts or regular checks to working people is because she just doesn't believe in those things, not because they're politically unhelpful. She doesn't believe in those things. She is paid. She is literally paid to not believe in those things. You know better than that. So real quick, I just want to give you my takeaways because I think it's important. First off, consider your theory of change, because if your theory of change is working with someone who has $45 million invested in real estate, you are not, under any circumstance, going to get rent forgiveness or mortgage forgiveness. This is a woman who makes a lot of money off of real estate. That's her financial interest. She's not going to look out for the best interest of the vast majority of Americans who are struggling to pay rent right now. Second, know your enemies. You need to know your enemies. Just because someone is in a caucus with you doesn't necessarily mean that they're in line with what you are pushing for. And look, maybe to call them enemies goes a little too far, but I think one of the most enlightening things for me personally in this 2020 election cycle was just the clarity that I now have of who's on our side, who's actually willing to work alongside progressives to accomplish the things that we need to better this country, and who's going to fight us. And there are a lot of people who pose as these resistance Democrats who are actually going to fight us harder than the GOP will. Okay. And again, this is a symbolic bill. If you can't even like message to voters, message to Americans that, hey, you know what? Republicans might fight us on this, but this is what we stand for. If you can't do that, then you don't stand for any of these progressive policy proposals that some of these lawmakers claim to. And then finally, why didn't these, like, there was a little more organizing happening among progressives. So it was mostly lawmakers and progressive groups. Why not involve some political activism with workers? We know that workers have been striking. We know that they're hungry for change. We know that they want to fight. They should have been included in this equation. Maybe a coordinated effort where, you know, like mass strikes happen throughout the country and workers will refuse to go back to work unless these progressive provisions are not only included in the House legislation, but passed in the Senate. I mean, hold these corporations' feet to the fire, right? So I just feel like that was really left out of the equation this time around. And I also want to just note, despite all the upheaval and all the anger toward what happened with this round of stimulus, the only like progressive who really voted against this was Pramila Jayapal. AOC voted for it. All members of the squad voted for it. And I get it. They feel pressured to vote for it because a lot of people are struggling and there are portions of this bill that are important. But we need to be more aggressive. And I think, again, the fundamentals are not in this bill. We need to ensure that people are taken care of medically and that they're not worried about losing housing as a result of this pandemic.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. I like how you say the fundamentals aren't in this bill. I've been obsessively watching The Last Dance, so I'm all about getting the fundamentals in play. But yeah, I think this is also why it's really important to look at maybe having a different conversation around even this idea of changing the Democratic Party caucus. I've been mentioning my buddy Dustin Guastella a lot, who's a union organizer and a Philly DSA, who also writes for Jacobin, has a really good stay at home that people should look up and watch. And, you know, of really thinking about the distinction between politicians who try to root themselves, and there's almost none today, as an example, in the labor union movement, and say, like, I will be the senator or the congressperson from organized labor, versus a lot of where the energy has been now, and we see it manifested in these different groups, some of which do some really good work, some of which like move on, do questionable moves like this. So I think if we properly understand move on, it kind of makes sense. Where you're really just looking at, you're just sort of playing a nicer version of Nancy Pelosi's game, which is that she really only cares about affluent suburban districts primarily. And some kind of so-called progressive groups are really interested in the same fight. They're interested in, like, basically, okay, what if we get the same safe Democratic districts with the same class composition, but move things a little bit more to the left? And I think that just to the point you're making, Anna, that formulation is really difficult because you're not going to be able to sustain any sort of momentum or pressure in that framework. It's going to always split towards people making the individual votes they think are best, or making like a calculation that might make sense. Like, hey, I don't want to be on record voting against these good things, versus I represent a constituency. These are those constituencies' non-negotiables. It's not, this or that poll number or flavor of the week. Like, there's an organization behind it, and I'm actually going to put some muscle into it. And ironically, a guy like Sherrod Brown, who's, not plenty of things, I'm not he's like not the most exciting politician in the world, but he's a senator from Ohio, and he's done a lot for labor at a time that labor has been under siege for decades. And he organizes his politics a bit more in that way. And I think that's actually a more relevant thing to learn from than, even some of these great progressives who don't have a context yet for sustaining these fights. And that's exactly what you just summarized there.